Hi, folks. I'm Rich Lucy, Senior Prevention Program Manager here at the Drug Enforcement Administration in our Community Outreach and Prevention Support section, and welcome to this episode of Prevention Profiles Take 5. Very excited about today's guest because I've known her for about as long as my federal career. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it's Rebecca Caldwell from Virginia Tech, and let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca. Dr. Rebecca Caldwell is the inaugural Director for Residential Wellbeing at Virginia Tech, where she leads a revisioned residential living model based in public health principles. She has over 20 years of experience in collegiate mental health promotion, collegiate and adolescent substance misuse prevention and recovery, interpersonal violence prevention and advocacy, and healthy campus community work. Rebecca has authored over $2 million in local, state, and federal grants. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of North Carolina, a master's degree in counseling from South Dakota State University, and a doctorate in educational leadership from Clemson University. And with that, Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So when I read your bio, I key in on that $2 million, in grants. That's actually how you and I met. So I started my federal career in 1999 at Department of Ed, and you had one of the first grants that I monitored. Was that 2000 or 2001?
It's probably 2002, I would be my guess. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, 2002. So I was about 3 years in, and I got to come down to the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where you were at the time. A beach campus, like to say, a beach setting, a very, very nice little setting down there. We'll get into all that. But it's like I said, you're one of the first people that I really got to meet and know on my federal journey. So I'm excited to have you on the podcast today. So before we get into the questions that I have for you, let's start with you telling us a little bit about Virginia Tech.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been with Virginia Tech since June of 2022. It's a fascinating and interesting campus. So it's a polytechnic university, which means that it is both a STEM campus and a land-grant campus. And so that shows up in fascinating ways. And so in any given day, you can be sitting with one student who's an aerospace engineer, and they're telling you about their summer work at NASA, and then the next student you're talking to is a poultry science major, and they're significantly involved in that career. Maybe that's kind of from their family farming background and so forth. And so we are both of those things. We're also a senior military college. So we're one of 6 senior military colleges, and that means we have a core of cadets on our campus, almost aiming for 1,400 of them. There's 1,200 cadets right now. A fascinating experience of really intense students who are also training for military or civilian careers, and we're good size. So we have over 32,000 undergraduates, a total of over 38,000 kind of between all of our campuses, and over 10,500 of them live on campus, which is a pretty large size population, and that's who I get to work with here.
So about a third of the students are residents, or they're residential then, about?
Yes. Yep.
All right. So I'm going to bring this up because, Virginia Tech, it was one of the darkest moments in our entire history. And, it's next week, I know, is the anniversary, 18 years. Hard to believe it's been 18 years. And for people who don't know, but I don't want to presume anything, it was one of the worst mass shootings that happened in our country. Does that still... is it so embedded as part of the culture now? I mean, it's hard that it couldn't be, but students are coming on campus. Obviously, it's kind of a generation removed, huh?
It is absolutely true that we now have students. It's been 18 years next week, which means that our freshmen, maybe we're literally infants or not yet born when it happened. But it is in the fabric of everything. And this place has a spirit and a pride in itself that's unlike any place else that I've ever been. And I think that people would very openly say, a huge part of that was born, in 2007 on that that day, particularly like April 17th, really. It's that's sometimes how they say that when there's so much of their spirit was born. And it is a very much like a post-incident campus, and we think about things differently, and I think something I've learned and really appreciated about the people who I've been lucky enough to work with here who are still here. And there are lots of folks who stayed on campus, and this is their home, and it's a unique place, and that people often get here and stay here is, that it was so unusual. I try to tell young professionals, like I remember where I was when the shooting happened, and I worked at UNC Wilmington. I remember very well. I was with a whole bunch of other grantees, and I want to say we were in Phoenix. And I remember calling my vice president and saying, like, do I need to think about coming back? Like, what is this happened on this campus that was nowhere near us? But that it was such a shock to the system. And I think as a country, we asked a lot of questions about what happened, and that, so I think, felt like blame to a lot of folks. And so there is both, I think, the wound of the lives lost that will never really heal, and then also I think what is still a healing process for lots of folks who lived through those months afterwards. And so you have to kind of hold both of those things all the time here. But also, like I said, it's at the heart of who they are in some of their absolute proudest ways. And so it's a complex place with a lot of special things happening.
Sure. Well, thanks for talking about it. I kind of felt personally there was no way I couldn't just bring it up, so onto a much more positive tone. I'll get right into our interview. So your title, you are the campus's first director of residential well-being. What do you see as the importance of this role, and what's your vision for the students' well-being?
Yeah. I think when I was like a lot of folks, it came through the pandemic. I was at the University of South Carolina during the pandemic. It became my job, and I myself was at a moment where I wondered kind of where was the field, and where were we going to find hope, and where were we going to kind of get back to some of the fundamentals of kind of really a forward thinking about holistic student well-being. And meanwhile, during that time, Virginia Tech had taken time to stop and think about their residential living model, and to just be real honest with themselves and say it wasn't working for them anymore, and that they felt like the needs that students had, they weren't quite meeting them, and that they thought they had so much more room and opportunity to bring their most important values very meaningfully into residential living. And they took a bold step, and they set it all down. And they said, if we were going to start from scratch as a division, because residential well-being is very much a 6-department kind of collaboration, what would that look like? And so I was down in Columbia, and people would come back from conferences or meetings of other Southern universities, and they would say, have you heard about what Virginia Tech is going to do? Have you heard about what they're thinking about? They're re-looking at their residential model through this public health lens, and what it has evolved. And I thought, I looked a little closer, and was lucky enough to be invited for an interview. And they said to me the first night at dinner, they're like, we're throwing kind of everything at the wall, and some of it's going to succeed and a bunch of it's going to fail. And I thought, like, I was just at such a place in my career that I was like, that's how I'm in for this. Like, I love to try new things. I think that's how I always ended up, in the grant world, was the opportunity to try new things with support. And I knew that their efforts were supported. But, there's a couple of fundamentals to it. One is just being unapologetically high touch. It is really a care and concern model. And we are very particularly using a combination of non-clinical case managers as well as kind of embedded counselors to very intentionally kind of touch students who come onto our radar screen as just fumbling in any kind of way. They have a mental health concern. They come onto radar as having a kind of a complex concern, that maybe they're like academic and financial and family things going on. And if we kind of have a sense that something's up with you, we're at your door knocking. And we kind of introduce those resources, and we kind of have changed everybody's mindset about like what we are here is to care about students and to be very hands-on and offering them this really rich set of resources. And so we knew that was really, really important. And it's been a really great fit for this campus. We've seen significant reductions in our amount of crises, situations that often just kind of maybe previously might have bumped along with different people knowing different pieces of it, hoping to get some resources in. We kind of take in hand and we think about who's our person who's of concern, and also who else is of concern, which is particularly relevant when you think about substance misuse stuff. It's thinking like, who saw this, who's in the orbit of this. And so that's really important. And in year one, we're like, we can only get one thing right. Let's get this high touch care and concern thing going right. And then we said, like a lot of places after COVID kind of had not lapsed, it just had drifted into kind of like the life of the campus. Like the student affairs functions happen on the outside of the halls, and then people were kind of coming home, and like that's where they like sleep and watch Netflix and maybe study. And we just said like, we are gonna really intrude and really make that stuff very seamless, a very porous relationship between the external student affairs departments and the residential campus. And so we reoriented those kind of traditional hall models, like being a hall director or being a resident assistant. And they all specialize instead now in our divisional priorities. And our top 3 divisional priorities are holistic student well-being, what we call experience PT, which is meaningful involvement, and inclusion and belonging. And so the staff in a district of students, we have so many beds. We knew we needed to be high touch. We were going to have to clump them together. And so we call them residential districts. And each residential district has basically a health educator, an involvement specialist, a case manager, someone who works on inclusion and belonging. And they together think about the students and together in that district, the buildings they take care of. And even the RA figure we revisioned as really thinking very mindfully about this high touch concept. And then kind of secondly, they each specialize in one of those 3 areas. And so if I'm a traditional freshman at Virginia Tech and I move into a residence hall, I have 3 upperclassmen, 3 RA type figures. We call them student leaders here, one of each of those 3 specialty areas. And they are working together to connect with us, to offer us a steady stream of programming that focuses in these 3 areas. And that has brought a lot more focus to the work we do. And we have seen some really good gains in with a much more focused model when it comes to actually like the educational side.
So are first-year students required to live on campus?
They are. So we only have a handful of first years who live off campus. They have, and just because maybe they live within maybe 15 miles or so. So overwhelmingly, almost everybody's with us the first year.
And where is in the hierarchy of like the structure of the university? Is it part of student affairs, or is it its own like branch, if you will, of the chart?
Great question. We are within student affairs, and I live under the assistant vice president for health and well-being, which is great. It's a table I always sat in as a lifelong kind of collegiate prevention and health promotion person. I've always kind of sat at the table with the director of health, the director of counseling, the director the director of rec, and the director of wellness. And technically, I do report up to and then part of Hokie Wellness. And so, instead of where often your residential life might be a self-supporting auxiliary, or it might be a standalone section of Division of Student Affairs. You could sometimes find it under a Dean of Students type model. Here we're kind of fully inside of the health and well-being model, so that that's my reporting line. That's how that's who my colleagues are. That's how we think. And so those are my thought partners kind of in any given week as we address issues. And we do really think about the issues that we address like through a public health mindset. And so those are the right thought partners to be at the table with, as I think helped us be really successful.
So what I heard you say, I was taking some notes. It sounds like, so the pandemic, 2.5 years, everything was turned upside down. It sounds like VTech took an opportunity. So I presume that most of the students went back home to their home environment, just like every other campus. And it sounds like that was the time VTech took to really kind of reflect, as you said, look at their residential living model and just say, you know what, this might be the opportune time. We can make a positive out of this big negative, and really looked at, we talk about the SPIF and strategic planning. It sounds like that VTech took that opportunity to really reflect on what it currently looks like and what it could look like. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to say it. And I think like a lot of Southern universities, I think that they closed kind of that spring of 20, and then kind of like limped along, kind of half filled, in terms of residential those years. But what they saw was that their students were suffering, as they were everywhere, right? That they were doing things like Healthy Minds and the National College Health Assessment, and their data on flourishing, on loneliness, on the mental health concerns. It's, it was dour, as it was for all of us. And so I think that one thing that was really attractive to me, and has remained the case, is just, I think that they took the opportunity to just, instead of kind of wringing their hands, like that was a moment that other places, a lot of us were thinking, we're never going to hire ourselves out of this very difficult mental health situation we're feeling in, like, what are we going to do? And instead, like, through some thought exercises and some really bold moves, they thought, I think we can get on ahead. Like, I think we could do some things really differently to possibly make things better for ourselves. And so there's a lot of hope in the model. The model has kind of a little bit of a magic to it that it just, it's very student facing. It's very, it's the right way to say it. It's just got a lot of hope in it. It just kind of says, like, it's very people centered, and we're, just like I said, unapologetically high touch, and has really met these students where they needed to be met. And I think there were some folks who were kind of neutral about it. Like, I think, I don't know that our police officers had any kind of opinion other than just being told, like, something was going to be different about residential living. And by about halfway through that first semester, they were our biggest fans, because things had changed tremendously for them overnight. Because this kind of early intervention model, the counselors we use in the model, they actually work in the afternoons and evenings. And so, a student who's just struggling a little bit at 7:30 in the evening could tell the RA figure, could just, they themselves know through our own education of them, that, oh, there are counselors here on the residential campus who would come and see me on a walk-in basis, or I can jump online and make an appointment with, and something becomes kind of, is managed, or at the very least kind of like triaged in the earlier parts of it being a problem, rather than that being kind of a crisis at 1 or 2 in the morning. And so that way in which I think we've historically been like, well, we got to get this kid through till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and they can get in line. Well, the other kids who are waiting to get, be seen at 8 o'clock in the morning, that tech has uniquely kind of resourced their mental health support to just undo that a little bit in a way that has worked really spectacularly for us.
So as I was doing my homework and doing some background on, about this initiative, so I read an article. It was on VTech's website, and I think, if I didn't write the date down, but this might have been in the fall of 2022. So this might have been still relatively early on, and the article said that the idea behind this initiative is to support the individual success, learning, and well-being of every student, both in and outside of the classroom. So, here in the government, we would call this like a whole of government approach. And so I kind of paraphrase it to sound, this is like a whole of campus, right, approach. So those whole of type initiatives can seem overwhelming. And we always try to advise people, don't try to do everything all at once, be incremental. So if any of our viewers are interested in launching an effort like this on their campus, where do they start?
Yeah. I think you're right in calling it a whole of, in essence, it is kind of 6 departments with a directive to work collaboratively. And so my role is not only kind of, in many ways, like helping the pro staff and the student staff manage the students day to day, but it's keeping these partnerships alive, and in strong collaboration. This is a fully matrix model. Pretty much about everyone in the model has 2 reports, and are part of a dynamic partnership. I speak with other campuses really, really regularly. We're lucky enough to have folks reach out and ask. And if someone said to me, I've just got this amount of money, or I can only do kind of this much effort, I would say a campus could get very, very far simply kind of resourcing that high touch piece. And so our non-clinical case managers, sometimes I'll meet someone like, oh, I'm a residential case manager. Also, how many of them are you? And they'll say, well, it's me. And I'll think, ooh, like we have 7, and I could probably kind of keep 3 more busy right away. Someone once said to me early on, they're like, they're really busy. And I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. Like once people realize the resource they are, now faculty are aware of them, students will refer someone to a case manager because the case manager helped them. Somebody said, I thought it would get a little less busy. I said, no, like we're still in like the field of dreams phase. Like people are aware that this resource exists, and can help them. And if anything, as we roll into, next year will be year 4 for us, which means, we're getting to that place where most students grew up in residential well-being. They lived it their first year. And so we're resourcing up other areas like our Dean of Students office, because people will pop back up and say, what I really miss about living on campus is the support of my residential well-being case manager. So I think resourcing our case managers is well worth it. And those RWB embedded counselors, I think they do embedded counseling inside residential models. I think so does people kind of, I'm sure there's plenty of ways to not do it well. And people sometimes like very quickly kind of get extremely hesitant when you start to talk about mixing kind of counselors. And so just to be super clear, and we had a great article about these guys in the Chronicle a while ago. They are very much traditional members of our counseling center who work in a very specific office, very specific hours. It's a best way to think about it. And just like in student affairs, we often will shoot them information to say like, hey, someone's coming on in. I know you can't say anything to us, but here's some things we're going to tell you. Or if there's enough concern, they can reach back to us and say, hey, this or that. They're very, very traditional. And the hook that our former counseling center director had that was so brilliant was they're social workers who are really kind of needing hours for certification. So they're supervisors of clinical social worker, and a couple of years of being an RWB counselor should set you up for licensure. And so we often find folks, they've got housing backgrounds, but they finished their social work degree, and this makes sense to them. And so I think that hand-in-hand partnership, I think, is a huge part of the magic. I've definitely talked with some campuses who've done that, and they're looking instead at the programmatic part. And I think that there's so many ways to do that. Before I kind of came back into residential living, I would sometimes think, boy, we really sometimes I think set residential education folks up by asking them to enforce the rules, know everything about a student, teach them everything about adulting, make sure they know every campus resource, and think like, I'm not sure why these 19-year-olds can't get this job done for these 18-year-olds. And so the focus also has just been huge for us to just say, like, we can't be everything to everybody, but we sure can think about the fact that, can you know campus resources well enough so that when you inevitably, for most of our students, move off campus that sophomore year, that you are so kind of connected to campus resources that the difference is you ride a bus over to campus now. What would that job look like if someone really kind of found their passions on campus, or they really understood the way that the well-being resources were there for them, or they understood the resources of Hookie Wellness so well in that first year that they just were connected enough so that would kind of stick on some level. And so we think a lot about, did they know the resources well enough so that the fact that they're with us 3 more years, they got those relationships and that knowledge that first year.
I know working at Department of Ed, I often heard, as monitoring grants and such, you'd hear from campuses say, it'd be nice if, we had the resources like the grantees do, because then we could, incorporate something like this. But what I heard you say, and I'll always tie things back to the SPIF, from a capacity building step, if as your advice, if a viewer was looking at a similar effort on their campus, is to start really just by thinking about it. I mean, that can be strategic in and of itself. And so whether you call it a SWOT analysis or a pro and con list, or a we have this, but we don't have this list. I mean, I think it comes back down to mapping out with no commitments at all, but just mapping out what you do have, what you're lacking and need. That sounds to me like a very important part of the process to get something like this started.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. You find not only what resources you have, but kind of who are your thought partners, and who might be just willing to try something different. A huge part of the success of this effort is just being willing to take a chance to try something different. And, we, for tech, most of what the resources we used to build residential were the residents' life resources. Their additional investment actually was mostly the counselors, the growth in the counselors in order to have them. And then we actually stood up a little bit more support for the housing resource side, so we could exclusively be a people-based department as opposed to a people and building-based department. And so it was so much of the success is just about good thought partners trying things differently, making a commitment to stop and look back. There were things that would happen in the first year. They're just processes, right? It's like an enormous bureaucratic machine, and something would roll, and I would think, no, we could do that better, right? Like we can handle very processes like financial disenrollment, or if someone is going to be, removed from the institution, like we can do that in a really high touch way. And we can put that layer on there, and that didn't cost a thing, just like a mindset change. So you're right. I think I really enjoyed, I had an opportunity to use the SPIF process and teach a whole lot about the social ecological framework. Towards the end of my first year, I had like every campus around a little bit of a problematic building, a little history, a little bad behavior, a little post-COVID acting out. And I pulled together a whole data report like I had learned to do, through all my public health concepts, and said, here's a whole bunch of data. Here's a whole data snapshot. Here's what we want to change. What kinds of interventions, what kind of levers could we simultaneously pull, kind of just up and down that social ecological framework, really thinking about concepts like, beliefs and perceptions, perception of consequences, actual consequences, environmental design. And we pulled a bunch of levers at once and really changed the experience of that space through intentional effort, and really helping everyone understand, hey, your part in this is part of this kind of bigger model. And a lot of people walked away, they're like, oh, now I get the public health thing. And I was like, yeah, that's right. We are a community, and a community can change its experience through public health principles. And that was a lot of fun that first summer once we got our feet under us.
So my next question, I've actually asked a couple of my more recent guests the similar question, because they're in the same space around wellness and well-being. There's been a lot of attention given to well-being and to wellness lately. So how do we ensure that issues such as alcohol and drug misuse don't get lost? I always use the analogy of my previous time at SAMHSA, when there was talk of integrating mental health and substance use. And I always kind of bristled at that concept, because it set people up, in my opinion, for turf wars. It's there's winners and losers if you integrate. Who's going to get more of the pie and who's not? And I always liked alignment, that these issues are aligned. So when we talk about wellness, which is a large concept, how do we help to ensure that one of the more significant drivers around wellness on campus, alcohol and drug use, that they don't get lost?
Yeah. And that has kind of always kind of perpetually been on my mind, because you're right that, all issues matter the whole time, but different ones get different efforts, and, and sometimes even they get different money, at different times. And so, I think it's important for us to always understand and not be afraid to say, that substance misuse is still perpetually our biggest public health concern on a college campus. And it's where we really need our talent, and so, misuse of alcohol is still the tent, under which a lot of trauma happens. It's a catch-all excuse for toxic behaviors. It's the ingredients that dial up, mental health crises, and yet still we kind of excuse it away. And so I think it's important for us to always kind of remember that while all of our issues are interconnected, so much of the harm that we see, so much of the things we care about have a basis or at least a coexistence with alcohol misuse, and that in order to keep people safe, in order to create healthy minds, healthy places for people to grow as individuals, that all of that's clouded, by misuse. And so we've got to make sure that it stays kind of somewhat first and foremost. I think sometimes it's a little bit of being willing to roll with what's popular and to remind everyone your part in it, right? And just be like, yep, this is a big deal. And then also, that substance misuse is front and center in this thing that we're focused on right now. So it's a little bit of beating the drum. It's a little bit of reminding people of the science of it. But yeah, it's definitely important to know that even though the spotlight goes different places, that the core is still right there.
Yeah, no, that's such great advice. I had a visual in my head when you were talking about interconnectedness, that it is part of that alignment. And I harken back, and I've dropped Laurie Davidson's name plenty of other times on this series. Where former staffer at the Department of Ed's higher ed center years ago used to say, alcohol and other drug prevention is suicide prevention. And when I think of this concept we're talking about here, I loved what you said about alcohol and other drug it's still one of the biggest, if not the biggest, public health issue on a campus, and that looking at preventing alcohol and other drug misuse is key. It's tantamount to the campus's overall wellness. I mean, you can make any connection basically between wellness efforts and student, substance use. So, I appreciate the way you said that about the interconnectivity. I all of a sudden have a diagram in my head, a graphic.
Absolutely. And our steps interconnected, right? I think I came in 20, 25 years ago during the time that we were very focused on the science of substance misuse prevention. It was such an exciting time. And sometimes people say, like, how did you know that to think about this as an intervention? I thought, well, this is what we did like 25 years ago. Like, this is all interconnected to the incredible work that we were doing, in those kind of early to mid 2000s. But, when there was we moved into a heavy focus on sexual violence, which was so important, and that spotlight needed to be there. But every bit of thing we did, all the things we did about bystander intervention during those days, there'd be tremendous connection to substance misuse. I think as the pendulum has swung a little bit more into mental health and well-being, we know that's so deeply interconnected with substance misuse. Like you said, it's suicide prevention. It's well-being prevention. I think the advent of us knowing and thinking about recovery on campuses, and our willingness to really kind of highlight that is honestly, I think, one of the best things that ever happened for mental health on campus, because people understand, like, it gave us that language to talk about, like, living with chronic, conditions that aren't just chronic medical conditions. We also call them medical, but, and so I think there's always a connection and always an opportunity to help use the fundamentals of misuse to also stand up and empower other types of prevention, and also kind of maybe see ourselves as kind of like OG experts who have stuff to offer and everybody else do.
It's so funny you said that. I wasn't thinking OG, although now it's in my head. But I'm always going to be a proponent of the prevention science. I grew up with it, and I think, with you and I basically being in this field for 25 years plus. And I think of our colleagues, and I'm not going to name any for fear of leaving anybody out, and I don't want to get an email saying, you didn't mention my name on the podcast. But, we can point, I think it really is incumbent upon us. I think we have the responsibility to keep steering our colleagues that we're working with either on campus, in a community, in the government, who maybe are new to this, to say, look, there is a whole science that's been around for 3 decades that drives us into what works and what doesn't work. And, I thought, all right, so for OGs, we're OGs, but some people will say dinosaurs, and I never liked that, that analogy. But I really do think that we have that responsibility to keep steering people to the science, because that's what drives us.
That's right.
So I'm glad that you're part of that clique. So
yeah.
My next question has to do with transitions. So I mentioned earlier on, when I first met you, you worked at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Then you worked at the University of South Carolina, and now you're at Virginia Tech. So as you moved into these different roles and different campuses, and every campus has its own culture, every community has its own culture. What was top of mind for you? What was important for you to hold on to and focus on as you became immersed in a new school climate? I mean, you couldn't have, we always say there's no cookie cutter approach in prevention. So what you learned at UNCW, maybe the principles you took, but it wasn't a template that you could just lay at University of South Carolina and then at VTech. So how in your mind do you map that out, like when you take on a new role?
Yeah. It's a great question, a really kind of fun question, to think a little bit about. I think, every campus is unique, and we know, from like prevention science, particularly with substance misuse, that they have, they have unique risk factors, which probably actually it's what trained my brain to think about it. So, when I was at UNC Wilmington, one of our risk factors was that kind of beach culture. On the other hand, we were not D1 athletics. And then I, moved to the University of South Carolina with 100,000 plus person football stadium and a vibrant bar district. And I knew from, my kind of days of kind of knowing what my colleagues were doing around the country who had those particular, challenges, and coming up, to tech, also D1, also, in intensity that with a little bit of, every once in a while we get a little work hard, play hard, to us. But also I think that when I think back on each of the transitions, I think what I always focus in on really, really quickly is what's going on with their students right now. And so, everyone has different risk factors. Everyone has different ways that they express their culture, as a campus. And so you've got to, of course, figure out, who the champions are, and how to make the relationships, and so forth to your champions, what ideas, light people up, and who gets lit up by new ideas. I think that for me, particularly the last 2 transitions has been really important, like who are early adopters of new ideas, who gets excited about new ideas, and then what's going on with the student body. I got to South Carolina right in January of 2016. It was still a time, I think that we were really struggling with stigma and really starting to do kind of some of the mental health promotion work. And I remember doing some focus groups those first summers and realized, and we walked away with kind of 2 things the students needed to hear at the time, which was your mental health matters to the institution, and it's okay to not be okay. And I used all my health communication training from all my AOD work to launch out. And now in 2024, it's almost laughable that we had to like probe for those messages and put that out there, because we've had such tremendous cultural shifts that both of those messages are very prominent, and stigma is reduced in an overt way. Though I feel like it's very insidious and covert at times still, but that was where we were at that time. And then, coming to Virginia Tech in this kind of post-COVID time, that we were just starting to inherit kids who we were still working with students who spent high school at home, and their maturity is different. Some of their values are different. Some of their skill sets are different. And so, I think knowing, you want to know the culture, you want to know what you're picking up, but more than anything, I think I honed in very quickly about what do these students need now, and what would it take to deliver them, and who are my early partners to lock arms with and do it. So
It's interesting you mentioned the pandemic. It really is that line of delineation. Like we think of, it's such a blur for so many of us, right? It just still feels like a blur, but it's like the pre-COVID world, and then there's that period, and then it's the post-COVID world. And you mentioned it. I mean, students who are coming to campus, they are coming with that whole hybrid, kind of mentality. There was 2 years or so of lack of interpersonal communication and connection. We as adults feel that. I mean, I know that, for the whole return to work, movement, I say to my colleagues here, and I know others in other places that say, we all had to learn how to work together again. And I don't mean collaborate. I mean, work in the same space. I mean, it was very, we had to relearn that, I think, to a degree. There was something that you mentioned, and I made the note about what's going on with the students right now. I was thinking of transitions because I looked at it from your perspective, your transitions from UNCW to South Carolina to Virginia Tech. But I just, in my mind, all of a sudden flipped it on its head. And for the school, it's a transition as well, because they have a new person coming in. And, it could be a person that obviously you got hired for the reasons that you did, but you may be challenging expectancies. You might be thinking, well, why are we doing it that way? I mean, when you really get into like the daily life of being on campus, all of a sudden you're like, why are we doing it that way? And so I think the transition does work both ways.
It does. It does. Absolutely. Yep. You're exactly right. And I think anytime a new leader comes into a section of a campus, they do ask questions about why are we doing it this way? Or have we ever thought about this or help me get at that value? And then my position was designed almost to intentionally disrupt, like I was like asked to implement a big idea. And so lots of folks were on board with it and plenty of folks weren't yet. And so, boy, that first year here, while like there were things about it that were incredible, there were moments that were so challenging. And luckily I kind of knew on some level, like, hey, this is, you've sketched out a dream and asked me to implement it. And so, and some things are going to turn out like you expect, and some aren't. And some folks who think they're real flexible are learning that they're not. It was quite a journey. They and we still have this mindset. They had a sense that they didn't think that they could completely turn residential living on its head, and hire and with a whole bunch of people who grew up in residential living. In other words, that had res life careers, and so almost maybe only a quarter or less of my team really have res life backgrounds. And so we pull people from public health and K-12 and community service boards and nonprofit management. We pulled people from all kinds of backgrounds on purpose. So they would ask hard questions, and they themselves would think, why do we do it that way? Or like, what's this aim? And they've made us so much better. But that's also a totally different set of emotions and care that you're managing. It is somebody who, has never been on call. And you're kind of starting at the beginning and going, yep, this is what the middle of the night is like on a college campus. Here's what we're gonna do. And some take to it. And some don't. And so the amounts of different types of change that we've managed here in these 3 years are pretty astonishing. And I think we're hitting our stride now and figuring out like right folks, right approach, right way to set people up for success. But yeah, being asked to come in and intentionally implement something that is designed to be very different. It's taken some fortitude, to say the least.
Bringing it back to the prevention science, risk and protective factors. I liked what you said. For anyone who's getting ready to make the transition into a new setting, whether it's a new campus, a new community organization, it's get to know your settings, own unique set of protective and risk factors. Whether it's, we know there's touch points throughout the school year, St. Patrick's Day, Halloween, spring break. But what about the campus's risk factors? I think of, any, I don't want to name them because I don't want to get in trouble with anybody, but, I think it's really incumbent upon us as professionals to know that landscape that we're going to start to interact with.
That's right. That's exactly right. Every campus is a system. Its community is a system. There are, and just like, just like we kind of think about in like things like doing community-based SPIF work, where you kind of figure out like, who are those community stakeholders? Like, where does that power actually lie? Who do you have to kind of get on board? A campus is that, times 10 sometimes it feels like. So it is a very intentional kind of figuring out how does this place work? And it's not exactly like you think it does. And in some of that you'll find out by being savvy, and some stuff you'll find out by walking into a glass wall. And then you just there's some scrapes and bumps that come with that, and you have to be resilient to that. But if you're transparent and genuine,
that's
you'll get through.
Awesome piece of advice. And actually, that's a great segue as we come to wrap up our interview. It's the advice question. I always say to folks, this is the question I ask of every guest as the last question. So what advice do you have for the folks who are working to prevent drug use and misuse among college students, as well as the students themselves? We know that students do, some faculty members actually assign the podcast as homework for students, which I found out a few months ago, which I think is great. But what's the advice you have for your colleagues who are doing this work?
I think if you get to do this work on a college campus, you've got to start from a place of, I think, appreciation and gratitude, because you're lucky enough to, universities are the home of, we are one of the places that creates science, that generates knowledge. And so, in some other buildings on your campus are brilliant people who are doing, really kind of concrete research, and you have the capacity to put that to make your campus a living lab of the most upcoming and accurate and kind of really foundationally based efforts that you possibly can. And how lucky can you be as a prevention, as basically a day-to-day prevention practitioner, to get to do the work, with kind of some brilliance around you who can advise you, and then in this resource-rich environment that we're lucky enough to work in, that while we are more aware than ever of the needs that college students have, they also are living in an environment in which they can change their mindset, their lifestyle, and their directionality extremely quickly. And even in the work I'm doing here at Tech Now, we thought we would say sometimes that first summer, like, this is probably a 5-year build. Like, we may have to retire out an entire generation of students in order for RWB to really take. And that was not true at all. Things had changed significantly within one semester. It was kind of the right fit for a student body that is like all of ours, bright, capable, change is very possible. Change is kind of, I think, reinforced in the fabric of what it is to be a college student. And so there's no better place to do prevention work, and there's no probably luckier prevention practitioner out there than a collegiate prevention practitioner. So I would definitely kind of give that advice. Changing your collegiate alcohol and drug environment changes everything about the students' experiences. And similarly, doing good work on the holistic student experience will actually also change your collegiate alcohol and drug environment. So you're not an island, right? Like everything that happens in your division, the good choices that can be made around academics, great campus community relationships, it all is kind of interconnected with the collegiate alcohol and drug environment that you're happening. So be a good partner, roll up your sleeves about everything, about improving the student experience, and get those partners to care about the changes that also can be part of like making a safer and healthier environment. For us, one thing that we've taught our student leaders, instead of simply teaching them about enforcing our rules around alcohol and drugs, is we advise them and teach them to approach every alcohol and drug situation that they come across with the word why in front. Like, why is the student in this situation? And lay out the possibilities. And we'll say, so is this their just belief about what a typical college freshman does on a Friday night? Like, or are they pretty lonely and this was a way to connect? Are they struggling academically? Do they have big, family stuff going on? Or is there mental health stuff going on here? And think about that. And that changes their mindset. Like, it's almost kind of like the fact that we are, we do the mechanics of addressing an alcohol and drug violation, but really it's almost incidental to seeing it as a chance to interact with a student. And I'll never forget, I read a report a couple months after we started, and it was a student leader, and she was out on, we call them community walks. We have really changed their mindset about what they do in the evenings, but she's out in the evening on the job, and she comes across she comes across a lounge once and stops and talks with a bunch of guys. They're working on a big school project. They're telling her about an engineering project they're doing. And she comes back around a couple hours later, and almost all the guys are gone except for one. And he's there. And then she notices, like, he's been drinking a couple of beers. He's by himself. Right. And she has a long conversation with him about what's going on here, and they explore like the academic pressure he's feeling, some of his family expectations, and how like after this really long night, like to him it made sense to like have a couple of drinks, and they had that whole conversation. And you know what, like, we express that over to conduct, like all the usual educational outcomes applied, for him, but really like instead of like suddenly this young woman who is a student leader, kind of RA figure, instead of that person getting into trouble, like she spent her time talking with them, and that was like, also we kind of have to address this, and in that way they're doing great prevention work, even though maybe and they get the same and the same. All of our obligations get met, but in a totally different way. That's about just seeing substance misuse and substance use at all as part of someone's overall holistic well-being and their overall student journey, and just exploring with someone like, where does this fit in, as part of the conversation about it being safe, healthy, and legal for them.
I'm sitting here with a smile on my face because I think that you could be the first person whose advice centered around appreciation and gratitude. It's this, I always say in prevention, we work in a field that has some terrific highs and some terrible lows. And yet, I think that's a great concept, to think, how lucky am I to be in this position, whether you're on a campus, you're in a community, and like myself, never having worked on a campus, but collaborating with professionals such as yourself. How lucky are we to celebrate that success with a student or with a professional? Or on the flip side, it may not feel it at the time, but being a sense of support for someone who needs it at a really tough time, in their life. And I think that there are probably plenty of people who want to be in our positions, and so we're lucky to be in the ones that we're in. So I thank you for that, for that advice, because I think that that's something we can all practice. I won't say more or better. I just think it's something we can all continue to practice in our professional life. So thank you for that. I do appreciate that.
Great.
So Rebecca, we're at the end. Again, it's been great to we've seen each other at conferences over the years, and it's a quick hug and a hello. But again, this is a chance for us to not even reconnect, but just to sit down and talk about these issues. But for me, again, you're one of the folks who, as I said early on, I met and got to know at the start of my career, and for all these years, it's just been great to have you as one of a great colleague along this journey.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich. It's been always so great to feel connected to you, and it's really is. That's very genuine for me. I feel so lucky to get to do this for a living. That I've just let my career follow my heart and be attracted to things that make a difference. And then I've always been lucky enough to be pleasantly surprised when they give me a paycheck, which is great because I have a mortgage and stuff. But I enjoy talking with folks who also equally just kind of love the work and its impact. So thanks for the opportunity to talk with you about it this afternoon.
Absolutely. And thanks again. And for our viewers, we always appreciate you joining us to watch this episode and all of the previous episodes that you can see on our website, campusdrugprevention.gov. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for watching and have a great day.